Hey guys, Sean here. Today, Luke and I are back with another tier list. Today we'll be finishing off the best anime decks tier list with the best VRAINS deck tier list.
Sevens does not exist.
Nope, not a real series. That is fake. Rush Duel is not real. We're playing some proper Master Rule 5 Yu-Gi-Oh! So let's get right into it. We have a few tiers here. We have
Salaman Great, Borolo Dragon D's Nuts, Burn for 200, Marin Sus, and Knockoff IKEA.
We'll begin with a pretty infamous deck. We have Gokis. I think Gokis are probably mid-tier because they did have their time in the sun being like the most insane FTK deck Yu-Gi-Oh's ever seen. However, now they're just really like not great. They're okay. They made an impact like 100%. Nowadays, they're not really seeing any play at all. They're a cool deck though. I do like the gimmick. I do kind of like their aesthetic. They are a cool archetype. But yeah, they definitely fell off. I'm glad they fell off because if this deck was still meta, that would be a bit much, even in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! That would be a bit too much to handle. But they have some pretty cool cards. I really like the Link 4 they have where I can just destroy a bunch of cards.
Honestly, I'd argue to put them in the second tier, Borolo Dragon D's Nuts, just because in the context of all these other decks here, they're definitely a bit stronger. I'm a bit of a sucker for warrior decks as well. I really like a few of the Goki cards. I really like Goki Guts. I think Guts is really cool. I'm a fan of like, if you're really stuck, you can just do a classic set Guts and pass, considering that Guts can't be destroyed by battle. Which, you know, is a bit gimmicky, but I quite like it. I do think that Goki is very good because it's a very accessible deck at the time as well, because a lot of these cards are printed out to be common, so it's very easy for you to get your hands on an actual Goki deck back in the day as well, and it's even easier now, of course. I'm just a sucker for powerful decks that like don't have high rarity, really expensive gimmicks and stuff like that. So I really do like the Goki deck. I'll put them in the second tier, Borolo Dragon D's Nuts.
Next up we have Adignister. Now obviously if we compare the two here, Adignister should go up here, but I feel like there will be a big bridge between these two decks. I feel like Adignister is obviously very good, still good in the modern day. It's just like kind of like Cyber's Pile type of deck. The main gimmick is that you have a bunch of different guys with different attributes and you keep summoning them and you go into a big towers monster which gets very high attack and they can pretty easily OTK as well. If we compare this to its closest counterpart, which would be Code Talkers, I think it's more consistent than Code Talkers, but I think Code Talkers kind of has a higher ceiling, can do a lot more. But as a deck, I do think Adignisters are really good. You could definitely argue for them to be at the top tier. Just a very solid, very consistent, very good Cyber deck.
Yeah, I definitely agree. They're a Cyber deck in every way you can apply that. They rely a lot on themselves, so you can basically make a full power deck using just Adignister monsters, but the fact that they can actually like mesh well with a few other Cyber cards is just really good. I'm still salty with this deck because the amount of times I got like Access Code Talker able to attack twice, OTK'd with this deck, is so goddamn annoying. So I definitely feel a bit of salt towards this deck, but I still have to admit that it is very good and very powerful, and it's consistent as well, considering that they're able to use so many other searches within themselves too. So yeah, they're definitely a very good deck. Not too sure if they're the top tier when it comes to all these decks that we're about to talk about, but definitely in the high end of Borolo Dragon D's Nuts.
Next up, Tindangles. What were they thinking? This deck is not even real. This deck is beyond awful. It doesn't do anything. It's not really even a deck. It's just like a few monsters that have a really bad gimmick. They just don't even do anything. I don't even know what this deck is. It's awful. Tindangle these nuts. Next up, Marincess. Everyone knows Marincess. They are not Marin Sus. They are very good. I would argue better than Adignister because Marincess have seen a lot more success competitively. Their whole gimmick is that they have a bunch of one-card starters, which can end on a very powerful Link 4, which is in a gate. And their engine is pretty small, so you can fit in a lot of non-engine, so you can just fill the deck with board breakers and hand traps, which is fantastic. Marincess have topped a lot of events. They're just a very solid deck. They're extremely consistent and very cheap, so it's really just a great deck to be able to pick up and play. Has a very high skill ceiling. Anyone can pick up the deck, but if you commit to this deck, you can see very good results. Their aesthetic is really cool. It's great to see a water archetype being actually good. We're all used to dark and fire decks being really good, but you know, a good water deck is great to see. So I think it's definitely one of the best decks introduced in VRAINS.
Maybe if we like reconsider everything, it might go a little higher. Maybe it might be on the low end of the top tier, but as of right now, it's sitting comfortably at the top of the second tier. Borlo dragging these nuts.
Speaking of Borlo Dragon, we have Boral slash Rockets. I don't want to consider this like Dragon Link because obviously Boral and Rocket cards are vital to Dragon Link, but this is not Dragon Link. This is just like pure Rockets, pure Borals, and they have a lot of really good cards. They have Borlo Dragon, obviously was a great card when it came out. Borlo Savage Dragon banned in TCG. An insanely good generic synchro that's just an Omni-Negate, which is insane. Boral End Dragon is one of the best boss monsters in Dragon Link. Then you have your Rockets, you have Quick Launch, which special summons a Rocket from deck. All the Rockets are dragons, so it's just free dragon material on field. Rocket Tracer, being able to pop a card to special summon even more Rockets. We have Striker Dragon, we have Boot Sector Launch. All these insanely good cards in Dragon decks. But if you're playing like a pure Rocket Dragon deck, it's only going to get you so far. The cards are fantastic, but if they're confined to the archetype, they're not as good as they could be. So that's why I think they belong about here. I do like their gimmick where they focus on destroying cards. Kind of like the Dragon deck version of Dinosaurs where they gain effects when they're destroyed. So you can destroy them and you can bring them back and they gain a bunch of effects. I really like the aesthetic. I think the monsters are really, really cool. But I do think they belong about there if you're playing them on their own.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Especially with those two Link 4s before Access Code Talker came out. They were the OTK enablers, especially with the likes of Burrosaur Dragon and things like that. I do like the monsters and the cards on their own, but it's just hard to talk about these without bringing up Dragon Link because they're so sensitive to Dragon Link. They basically shape the whole deck in itself. But as an archetype within itself, it's still pretty good. I think they're just edging over Gokis just because of the whole Dragon Link stuff. If they're on their own, yeah, they probably still out Gokis maybe a little bit, but I kind of feel like they're on par. But yeah, it's kind of hard to talk about them without even like mentioning how good Dragon Link is.
Next up we have Trickstar. Everyone loves burning for 200. Trickstar is a very funny archetype. I do like it a lot for being just like silly. It's a very gimmicky, funny archetype. Genuinely very, very strong when it first came out. One of like the best decks when it was introduced. Their whole gimmick is that they have a bunch of cards that when your opponent does anything, they can be burned for 200. And that can stack, and it can be not once per turn. And you can just burn your opponent to death 200 life points at a time, which is really, really funny. They're very consistent, they can all search each other. They have really good link monsters. They have really funny gimmicks as well. Cards like Trickstar Reincarnation combined with Droll is just a full hand rip, which is really, really funny. So one of the best decks when it came out. It has fallen off a lot, but it is getting new support, which is really cool. A fan favorite deck, but I think it belongs about mid tier.
One thing I will say about them is that the deck is still kind of pricey enough because all of these cards were never really commons. They're all like ultras and secrets and stuff like that. Even Light Sage is still like a pricey enough card considering that came off the ban list recently. You can still pick this deck up for like relatively cheap enough, but it is expensive, so it's not the easiest deck to access. And considering the power level in comparison to how hard it is to access the deck, it's not the greatest. It's definitely far, far away from what Marincess is. But you know, I think they're pretty cool. I like the aesthetic of them. They're pretty interesting, and burning for 200, just very, very funny. What more can we say?
Next up, Salamangrates. Definitely one of the best decks introduced from VRAINS. A really, really good Link deck. One of the main parts of TOS format. And even now in a Fire format, it still sees plenty of play. Still very relevant. The new support the deck got recently is really, really good. The direct Salamangrate support in combination with just generic Fire support like your Promethean Princess make this deck insanely strong. They're really cool because they're a really big kind of wombo combo deck, but they end on some really strong interruptions and traps. They have a searchable counter trap, which is an Omni-Negate. They have the trap card that can tribute a Salamangrate monster and then destroy cards in the field up to the Link rating of that monster, which you can easily end on a Link 4 Salamangrate, so you can just easily pop 4 cards whenever you like. The deck is absolutely crazy. Really cool that the deck stayed relevant. It was obviously one of the best decks in TOS format, and even now, it's just a fantastic deck. I think it definitely earns its spot in the top tier.
Yeah, I definitely agree. This is by far the best deck out of everything we're going to talk about in this video. Salads are just really, really good. They were so powerful during TOS format that they had to get absolutely crucified by the ban list by banning their rank 3 guy and also limiting Gazelle to 1. But Salads are at full power now and they're back again and they're still seeing a lot of play. They're not topping events per se, but they are still making appearances here and there and they're doing very, very well. The new support that they got recently enough is fantastic as well, but it's also that Link 4 is generic enough that's able to fit into a few other fire decks too, which people like to take advantage of a little bit, but that's fine. It's a really, really good card. We don't blame people for doing that. I do like the gimmick when they have that field spell up that they're able to use link monsters as themselves to kind of go into other copies of themselves. I'm a big fan of combo decks that are able to set up like some very good negation, as you already mentioned, having that Salamangreat Roar. The counter trap is of course very powerful as well. The fact that the deck is consistent enough that's able to search itself out and like doing a lot with very little, I find to be very, very good. So Sal is definitely the best deck on this list.
Speaking of a good deck, we have Topologic. They're not good. It's not really a deck, it's a few extra deck cards that they are very good. Bomber Dragon, not really, but Zeraboros is fantastic. Gains a bunch of attack depending on how many banished cards you have. Really good for setting up for OTKs. Really good in kind of like mill decks or like decks that banish a lot. On Master Duel, you see it a lot in tier builds where you can use Snow, banish a bunch of cards from the grave, go into this, and then you can get up to a bunch of attack. And its main effect is where if a monster is special summoned to a zone it points to, you just wipe your opponent's board, which is absolutely insane. Topologics do have synergy with Boral cards. The more recent Boraload Link Tree monster is able to bring out some Topologic cards, so they do have some synergy, but for the most part, it's not really an archetype. It's just some really powerful monsters, and they are really cool, but you cannot really play this as a deck, so it does belong very low on the tier list.
Okay, Appliancers, they're not great. Honestly, they're probably worse than Topologics. They're just not good. So Appliancers, they have a few different attributes, but mostly rely on like Water and Dark to go into their Link monsters. They have very puny attacks, so they're not like the greatest, but they're able to spam the board a lot. And they're even just able to spam even more based on the gimmick that if some of their Link monsters are co-linked with other Link monsters. Co-linking is one of those like gimmicks or those mechanics that had a lot of potential when Link first came out, but they just never really went anywhere. If you think of all the Link monsters we have in this game and the amount of them that actually talk about having more effects when they're co-linked, it's very few and far between, just because that's never really what the whole potential of Links were meant to be. And just co-linking is such a bad gimmick, and having the payoff of what the Appliancers can do when they're co-linked of just warring the board even more with more Appliancer monsters, it's just not worth it, because the Appliancers are just not great on their own, and it will take a whole lot of support before they are anything great, but for the time being they never really did anything at events. They're not doing anything now, pretty much just a forgotten archetype. Definitely Marin sus.
Next up, Dino Wrestlers. I think it's good and bad. Obviously, Dino Wrestlers have some really strong cards, specifically Pankratops, one of the best cards in the game. Limited for the longest time, now we're slowly seeing it come back. A free special summon that you can tribute to destroy a card in the field is just really, really good. Generic as well, you don't need to be running a Dino Wrestler deck to use Pankratops. Dino Wrestlers as an archetype, they're cool enough. They have some really strong links and they have some synchros and stuff like that. It does bother me that they don't really synergize with like modern dinosaur cards. Even though all the Dino Wrestlers are dinosaurs, they don't really kind of do anything with like dinosaurs themselves, besides Pank obviously. So that does kind of suck, but it is a cool deck. They are kind of a battle phase focused deck, that's the whole point, because they're dinosaur wrestlers. They will be doing stuff during the battle phase, but as we all know, the battle phase is not the most important phase in the game anymore. So yeah, I think they're cool. The aesthetic is funny. They have some really strong cards. They're a fun enough deck to play, but I don't think they're any better than mid-tier. Unless they get new support in the future, I think they're going to stay here for a while.
Having one good card in Pankratops is more than what a bunch of other decks can say for themselves, so it deserves its spot in the middle of the tier list.
Next up, Code Breakers. Kind of similar to your Topologic. They're not really an archetype in themselves. They have like 2 or 3 Link monsters, and that's about it. Similar to Appliancers, they do kind of revolve around co-linking, which, as Luke already said, co-linking is just a bad mechanic. If they're co-linked, they can kind of spam the board and you can link climb fairly easily. And your main payoff is your big link tree that can pop spells and traps up to the number of co-linked monsters, and that's it. You will see some of these cards in like generic Cyberus link decks, but only really as extenders, and they're not even that great. They kind of look cool, and I think the idea of Code Breakers would be cooler if it was kind of like an anti-Cyberus deck. That would be cool, because the whole point is that they break the code. They're kind of like the opposite of your Code Talkers. But no, they're just really bad. They have kind of cool designs, but that's about it. Not really worth talking about.
On Wikipedia, their weakness section is larger than their etymology section, so that should say it all right there. Not a good archetype.
Next up, Code Talkers. I think they belong about... It's really tough to say. I don't think they're above Marincess, but I don't know if they're above Adignisters either. They're a good deck, obviously, but you don't really see people playing it much. So their main gimmick is basically spamming the board with a bunch of Cyberus monsters and you linking your opponent, which basically means that you're occupying both the extra monster zones on the field so that your opponent cannot special summon monsters to the extra monster zone. In combination with something like an Ibli lock, your opponent's locked out of special summoning anything. So it's a really kind of funny gimmick, very difficult to pull off. It is very weak to hand traps if you're trying to go for the U-Link version. But it can do a lot more. You can obviously easily go into access code and stuff like that. You can get them up to 2 attacks, you can boost them up really high. There's a lot of really good kind of generic Link monsters you can go into. Code Talkers are kind of your main engine to go into stuff like your Firewall cards, which I guess we could have ranked Firewall as its own thing, because Firewall does have a lot of new extra cards, but I kind of want to just include it with your Code Talkers. Firewall cards are really cool as well, so we can just kind of give that a boost. It is essentially just Cyberus good stuff, and it's really cool. It is cool that you can play it in a bunch of different ways as well. You can try for your U-Lock, or you can try to just set up some broken Link monsters. But overall, it has not seen the exact same amount of success as decks like Marincess. But I think it's a very good VRAINS deck, so I think it belongs pretty high up.
Yeah, it definitely deserves to be high up, but I don't think it's as good as Adignisters. I mostly say that because Adignisters have a lot more cards in their card pool that they have at their disposal, but not only that, Adignisters actually take advantage of Code Talker's arguably best card, which is Access Code Talker. So the fact you're able to play the best Code Talker card in Adignister itself means Adignister is probably just the better archetype overall. But Code Talkers are pretty interesting because they do have very good cards, but no one's really doing much with them at all. They recently got a Link 1 that was supposed to like elevate it to like, oh, this is the next level, this is an anime card we've been waiting for it to be printed to make Code Talkers very, very good. But no one really did anything with it. Yeah, it's still a fine card and it can still work well in the deck, but it's just not being able to pull in the wins that maybe a deck, like a main anime deck, should do. It's definitely far from Heroes or anything else like that, so it's a fine deck, especially when we're talking about it in the context of this tier list, but yeah, definitely deserves kind of like in the middle of Borderload Dragon these nuts.
Next up, Altered Geist. I'm thinking about here.
I think it's better than Goki, to be honest with you.
Okay, right, we'll put it up here then.
Yeah, I put it a lot higher. Altergeist is one of these decks that is just, it's always going to be rogue. Trap decks are insane that, like, they can just, you can be so underprepared for trap decks like this that it can be really, really frustrating when you're facing them and they're able to just absolutely pop off doing some really, really powerful things. And it's so infuriating with Altergeist because it's just one of those decks that I keep forgetting how good it is until I'm facing it. It's just really, really good and really consistent. The fact that these guys have effects in the hand as well as on the field is just really, really annoying because they're able to spam themselves out and still search for traps, and you still have a bunch of back row to deal with as well. So not only are you dealing with some heavy hitters in the front, you're also hitting with some like really, really tricky back row to play around. So I think Altergeist is definitely one of the better decks on this list. I think it's overlooked just a little bit.
That's a good point. It always gets like random new support every now and then that really does help it out. Some really strong Link monsters. Their traps are just like very strong and very annoying to play around. Even they're like small monsters, they just like bounce themselves to the hand, they have battle tricks. They're a very annoying deck to play against, but they are pretty cool. Shoutouts to DZF. Next up we have Sunvine / Sunavalon, one of the villain decks from VRAINS. Now, if you're thinking like, oh, Sunavalon, Rika, all that stuff, I'm not going to include like all Plant Link type of stuff. We're just going to talk about the same way we talk about Borderload in context of Dragon Link. We'll talk about Sunavalon in context of just Sunavalon, not really Plant Link. It is underwhelming when you look at it this way. It doesn't do too much. The main gimmick is that you have your Sunseed Genius Loki, which is a normal monster. You summon it and you link off into your Dryas. Dryas will search you Sunvine Sowing. And basically, you are slowly linking up into your Link 4 Sunavalon monster, which can search your trap. And then your big Link 4 can gain a bunch of attack and attack multiple times. So it's kind of gimmicky in that way. It's just like, get a big boss monster out, make it really hard to get rid of, and then get it to a bunch of attack and attack for game. It has Sunvine Trasher, which is really good for OTKs. can gain multiple attacks and can boost his attack up by a lot. But overall, it is a very small archetype. A lot of the cards just don't really do anything, but it is very cool, very unique. Really cool that a deck kind of just revolves around like one normal monster and is actually like kind of decent. But yeah, not nearly as good outside of like a Platinum Link deck as something like Boarload would be. Boarload on its own is way better than something like Sun Avalon. So yeah, I think it belongs in about the mid tier. Probably, let's be honest, like about here. And finally we have Allure Queens. So Allure Queens, they were an archetype before VRAINS. They had like they were the level type monsters where they would like level up like your Silent Swordsman and stuff like that. Back when Yu-Gi-Oh was awesome and we had really weird kind of gimmicks like level monsters. But they are getting new support, they are getting a cool Link monster. Their gimmick is kind of like equipping cards, so you equip your opponent's cards to them and then they can level up. They got new support very recently with Chaos Allure Queen, and they have more support in the OCG that will be coming out soon. Very cool aesthetic, very funny gimmick. It's cool that an old kind of archetype will get, you know, a revamp, which is great. But overall, very much not the best. It's a funny gimmick, cool aesthetic, all that, but it's not great.
Yeah, they need to change that completely, because just the way like Allure Queens are, like what they used to be like leveling themselves up by taking your opponent's monster and equipping them to themselves. There's a few reasons why this is very, very bad. It's just because like they need to be taking monsters that have a level, but considering that your opponent could be playing like Lynx and XZs, which are very, very popular now, those monsters don't have levels, so the Allure Queens can't just like take them for fodder in order to level themselves up. But also they suffer from the same thing that like the Armed Dragons kind of suffer from, is just the fact that it can be very bricky if you open them in your hand, like the higher level ones, so you can't normal some of them out. And not only that, they can also like be very, very vulnerable to like the likes of Ash Blossom and stuff like that. And also the fact that since they're taking the opponent's monster and putting them in spell and trap card zone, there's no like guarantee that like their effect fully go off, that they're able to level themselves up, because once they're in the spell and trap card zone, they're then vulnerable to spell and trap destruction. So they're not great. The whole deck needs a revamp. The new support that comes out like helps them a good bit, but they're definitely far from the best.
Alright, so that's it for our best anime decks VRAINS tier list. We have done all of the main 6 series of Yu-Gi-Oh! We started with Duel Monsters, we made it to VRAINS. All of the anime decks in the series have been ranked. I think it's fair enough, specifically for this one here. I think Salads are like the best kind of deck in VRAINS. They're just fantastic, and the support they got recently just really shot them up there. They are definitely miles apart of the other decks in the tier list. And of course you got the bottom tiers, which is just like, maybe someday, you know, maybe someday they'll get some support and make them the best deck in the game. But anyway, that's it for our anime deck tier list series. Thanks for watching. If you have any other ideas for tier lists we can do in the future, let us know. If you want to see our content early, we have memberships you can check out. And make sure you check out our affiliate links in the description. We have a TCG Player affiliate link, which you can use if you want to buy some of these decks in real life, and it directly supports the channel. So thanks for watching, stay tuned for more content.